are we today? The Bible and Modern Science, Class 10. This is an important day to be in class. Hate to say that for people who are not here, but what we're going to do today is to kind of sum up in a transitional way everything that we've done so far by showing what happened in the transition between an age of belief and the age of skepticism. And what happened was that a psychological transition took place, more than a logical transition, but it's had a tremendous impact on the history of Western culture, on the history of Western education, on the history of Western intellectualism, and on the history of Western life. Last time we were talking about some of the important people whose thought led up to this psychological transition, even though they themselves would have been shocked that what they said and what they did actually led to an age of skepticism. But we talked about Newton and other folks. In the 18th century, many thinkers of the Enlightenment wanted to extend all problems, the methods that had been so successful in physics. Newtonian physics was taken as the model not only for other natural sciences, but also for the scientific solutions to the problems of society. In other words, the Enlightenment produced a large number of very heavy-duty thinkers. And what they did was to pick up on Newton's mechanical view of the universe and apply some kind of reductionistic thought to it, and came up with an answer to almost everything based on a Newtonian physical model. Hume, for instance, emphasized the empirical side of science and concluded that any idea that cannot be traced to sense data is without significance. For him, empirical verification is the criterion of all knowledge. And it's on this basis that he did his critiques of all of the arguments for the existence of God, since the arguments for the existence of God, from his perspective, do not have enough sensual data in order to verify any results of such an argument. For Kant, science and religion occupy entirely different territories. And as I said, this has become a favorite way for science and religion to kind of get along together for a long time. Whether you actually believe in God or don't believe in God, the assumption has been that you keep God out of science and you don't discuss either the arguments for the existence of God scientifically or any particular religious doctrine scientifically. For non-religious people, or agnostics, or atheists, or skeptics, the reason why you don't do that, of course, is because there is no God and there's no use getting him mixed up in real knowledge. For theologians, the reason for that is that the real knowledge of God does not come through science, but comes through revelation. So that's a place in which a lot of scientists and theologians have kind of come to a happy medium. Laplace is the one who is one of those who really applied his reductionism to scientific knowledge. He's the first one, as far as we know, to write a book about science without mentioning God, and he's the one that Napoleon called in and asked how he could do such a thing without mentioning God, and Laplace's answer was, "I have no need for that hypothesis." So God had descended in the minds of many intellectuals in Europe from the sovereign God, the Creator, to a scientific hypothesis. And when he did descend to a scientific hypothesis, then the more you found out about science, the more you were able to explain in totally mechanistic and scientific terms. Then the less you needed a God who was merely a scientific hypothesis. Unfortunately, lots of people today think that that's still all that God was a scientific hypothesis, and therefore, since science has filled in most of the gaps, the God of the gaps, the scientific hypothesis, is of no necessity or no use, in fact, whatsoever. Some thinkers, as a result of this, portrayed God as the remote and impersonal clockmaker, the cosmic architect of deism. And deism was a very important intellectual strain in the American colonies. If you want to understand American history in its beginning, you have to understand theology. Specifically, you have to understand Puritan theology, and you have to understand deism. And the interesting thing is, most of the people who were deists were really extremely liberal Puritans. And so Puritanism is indispensable. Understanding Puritan theology is indispensable to understanding deism, because you go from a sovereign God in Puritanism who is in control basically of everything to a God in deism who has kind of lost control and is kind of watching from afar. And he's the guarantor of the reality of existence. In other words, without him, nothing would exist. He's also the guarantor of the laws of nature, but they now run without any irregularities whatsoever. And he's also the guarantor of the moral law, and therefore, for most of these folks, including Kant, he's also the guarantor of immortality. In other words, when Kant separated religion from science, he did not give up proposing an argument for God's existence. The only difference was, instead of an argument from God's existence based on the cosmos, a cosmological argument or an argument from design, he argued for God's existence in the sense that he believed you had to postulate God in order to explain moral law and the moral nature of the universe. The point of all this is that all these people we've been talking about, with the exception possibly of Hume and Laplace, and there's even questions about how far they went in an atheistic direction. But all of these people that we've been talking about, the revolutionaries of modern science, and Laplace is 100 years after the revolution of modern science, all of these folks were devout Christians, and it would have boggled their mind to believe that anything they had said or anything they had discovered would eventually lead to an age of skepticism about the existence of God. Now, there was the Romantic movement, which was a reaction to this skepticism. It wasn't a reaction, most of it in the Enlightenment was not, during the Enlightenment, was not a reaction back to Orthodox Christianity, but it was a reaction against the extreme of nature as a machine, and it pictured nature as a creative, spontaneous, and growing, and permeated by beauty and an underlying spiritual reality. And so you go back to an emphasis on the immanence of God in nature, not so much the transcendence of God, but the immanence of God in nature. And if you got the immanence of God in nature, then you have the basis for the human soul, however it is understood. Now, there was a religious aspect of the Romantic movement in pietism. Pietism is generally the German version, and Methodism is the English version of religious romanticism. These were evangelical revivals, and these folks were basically orthodox in their views, but they were especially interested in reviving the biblical view of a personal God who is actively related to humanity. Now, they didn't say much about nature. They did say some things about nature, and what they said about nature was basically similar to what Calvin and Luther had said about nature. But they were more interested in how God related to human beings through revelation, that is, through history, and through personal experience. So from their perspective, the reductionism of Laplace was simply absurd. It doesn't make any difference what you know and how much you know about science and how much you know about nature. You cannot possibly, on the basis of that knowledge, exclude the concept of a personal God actually being involved in his creation and particularly involved in history, and particularly involved in personal lives. So this was the essence of the religious romantic response to reductionism. Now, we need to summarize some of the methods in theology that were at issue during the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, the idea of historical revelation came under increasing attack. And that is really the key to the continuing, ongoing conflict or battle, supposedly, between science and religion, is the idea of revelation. If somehow or another science has disproved the possibility of a personal God getting in contact with his people, that is, the people he has created in his own image, if somehow or another science has ruled that out, then obviously any orthodox or theistic or biblical conception of God is ruled out. And many people, as a result of some of the things the Enlightenment philosophers said, Enlightenment scientists said, assume that somehow or another something has been said or done or something has been discovered that rules out the possibility of a revelation from a transcendent God to his creation. Pietism later recovered the conviction of the Reformation concerning the centrality of Scripture in religious life. And there are certainly Methodists left in the world, and many of them are good scientists. And so you can see that there's a give and take here that eventually produced our present kind of pluralistic situation, where you have excellent scientists who are also pietists, and you have excellent scientists who are totally opposed to any concept of revelation or any concept of God. And some of these scientists wonder how in the world another scientist who is a good scientist can possibly lack the intellectual integrity that would allow him to go to church every Sunday. And this then is the remaining conflict. Natural theology is also a method in theology. The earliest part of the century saw extensive development of the arguments for a first cause and an intelligent designer. In the 19th century, William Paley was still used as the basic theological text in universities. And he was the architect of the kind of classical argument from design. His argument from design was generally considered to be demolished by Darwin's theory of evolution. But that doesn't mean the argument from design has been demolished. People have been working on it ever since, and they're continuing to work on it. One of the interesting sidelights of the history of the theory of evolution is that Darwin was not a science major at the university. He was a theology major, and his principal study was William Paley's argument from design. And many people can see William Paley in the structure of the book, The Origin of the Species. In other words, here again is a situation where someone picks up on a scientific thread, but he can't let go completely of his theological training. And certainly by the time of the writing of The Origin of the Species, Darwin had not given up on his idea that God was a creator. He just was not a special creator. That is, he was not responsible for what is called special creation. That is, the creation of human beings and animals as separate species at some time in the near past. He had obviously could not continue to hold that if he held his theory of evolution. But he still mentions God in his book, which Laplace didn't, and still talks as if there is some possibility of a conception of God despite anything that I have ever discovered. Now, he later became somewhat more agnostic in his views, or pessimistic in his views, let's say. Toward the end of his life, he not only quit reading theology, he quit listening to music and other things that a romantic might consider important. But then another method in theology is moral and religious experience. And of course, a reductionist will reduce all moral and religious experience to also mechanical causes or as really non-events. The Romantic movement defended intuition, imagination, and the immediacy of experience. The Methodist revival, though traditional in doctrines, encouraged experiential religion and personal reorientation. Kant found the basis for religion in the experience of moral obligation. Kant was basically a German pietist who became one of the important persons in the Enlightenment. The concept of human nature, of course, is the victim, you might say, of this discussion, because most authors of the Enlightenment held an optimistic view of humanity, deriving primarily from their confidence in human reason. And you might say, well, isn't that good? Well, from an Enlightenment perspective, of course, it is good, because from the Enlightenment perspective, what you've done is you've gotten rid of all of the pessimistic Christian ideas about sin and the devil and the need for salvation. So without the revelation that Christians believed took place, the revelation not only of the nature of God, that is His self-revelation, but when God reveals Himself, He also reveals something about human nature. And in contrast to God, human nature was quite frail, and human activity was in fact in rebellion against God. And so sin, the doctrine of sin, has to have its context within a concept of God. Otherwise, it's just a doctrine of evil or suffering or something else. Sin implies that there's some kind of moral responsibility, and human beings have actually broken the laws of God. Now, there's still people who don't believe in God, who have acute response to someone who asks them if they believe in God. They will say, well, no, I don't believe in God, but I still believe in the devil. In other words, there's more evidence for the devil than there is for God. And in a sense, a Christian theologian would agree with that. There is more empirical evidence for the existence of the devil than there is for the existence of God. All you have to do is read your newspaper every day or watch the news. And so from the perspective of religious people and Christian theologians, the loss of, the gain of an overly optimistic view of human nature was actually a tremendous loss, because by gaining this overly optimistic view of human nature, we were unable to deal with the 20th century, which began with World War I, which basically destroyed completely European optimism about human beings. But there was nothing in the background to take its place, except among pietists who continued to hold that there was such a thing as sin, and that World War I and Hitler and World War II were examples of it. And if you have an overly optimistic view of human nature, whether or not there's a God, if you have an overly optimistic view of human nature, then it's going to be hard to interpret the 20th century. It's not sin according to the Enlightenment, but it's ignorance, which is the basic human problem. And so a better education and social planning are the answers. I remember seeing very vividly an advertisement that was filmed by Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson came out of a fairly pietistic religious group. But in this advertisement, he was saying that the only salvation for America is education. Well, religious people, even pietists, would assume that education is an extremely important part of the human endeavor, and would bring about a tremendous amount of good results. but they would never have said that education is the only salvation. And that's not only because of what they believe has been revealed, but because of experience. The most educated, the most religious, the most intellectual country in the world, or in the European world, in the 1930s was Germany, and it obviously did not prevent one of the worst evils in human history. Now, with all of this in mind, I want to move to a statement of part of our thesis by a man named W.T. Stace in a book called Religion in the Modern Mind. And the reason why this is not one of your textbooks is because it's out of print. But it is an extremely important statement of this transition between the age of faith and the age of skepticism. In fact, this is the book that this was one of the main textbooks in the course, in the first course that I ever had on this subject at Rice University under William Austin, who is now a teacher here. And I wish that W.T. Stace was still around so that he could revise it, because it makes a good book to read for the average person in a course like this. He begins by saying that the famous conflict between science and religion is commonly thought of in terms of the supposed contradictions between specific dogmas of religion and particular discoveries of science. For instance, the discoveries of geology shattered the belief that the world was created in 6 days a few thousand years ago. The Darwinian theory of evolution showed that man is not a special creation unrelated to the animal kingdom. Well, the first thing we need to know about these is that these are really kind of superficial aspects of the conflict between science and religion, especially when you understand that all of the people who believed that the world was created in 6 days a few thousand years ago were Christians, but all of the people who in geology who discovered that the world was around several 100,000 years at least were also Christians. So that's really not a conflict between science and religion. That's more of a superficial thing that was basically easily dispensed with by most 19th century and 20th century scholars, Bible scholars and theologians. The Darwin's theory of evolution is a little bit more difficult, but in fact a great many Christian scholars had already come to terms with the theory of evolution before Darwin produced his book. And one of those theologians who had come to terms with the theory of evolution before Darwin produced his book was Darwin. Now, he later quit reading theology, and so he did not keep abreast of any of the responses of very intelligent theologians to his theory. In fact, what he mostly heard were the shrill cries of clergymen who had no scientific understanding, and this actually colored his later life in his view of religion. And he's helped along there by Thomas Huxley, who was really about the only agnostic in this whole discussion for a long time. In fact, he's the one who invented the word agnostic. And it was only later, toward the end of his life, that Darwin would even concede that perhaps agnostic fits his view. Atheism, he never would concede that ever fit his view. But even if a scholar did not accept Darwin's theory of evolution, Bible scholars were certainly not in the camp of those that believed that animal kingdom was not related to human beings. The word animal in the ancient world, in ancient Latin, meant that which has a soul, and there was no doubt in the minds, I believe, of even medieval theologians that human beings were animals, but they believed that human beings were animals who had been given a special dispensation or a special gift from God, which is called the image of God. The Bible itself, in the first chapters of Genesis, as we're going to see in the next few weeks, the Bible itself indicates that human beings are made from the same stuff as animals. So there would not have been any problem with educated Christian theologians with understanding that there is a commonality and a relationship, even a kinship between human beings and other animals, but that there was still a special relationship between human beings and God, and that was not necessarily biological similarity. Even from the perspective of a medieval theologian, a monkey looked more like a man, or a man looked more like a monkey than either one of them did God. So there was an understanding of a relationship. But still, that's a kind of a superficial problem which was very easily dealt with by most Christian theologians. So it is not really the major conflict still between science and religion, though that's the one that the newspapers pick up on, particularly because of its implications for educational policy in the United States. The application of scientific techniques of historical and literary criticism to the Bible proved that book is not a literal record of facts dictated by God. A long history of scientific discoveries of this kind produced a series of shocks in the domain of Christian belief. Now, even here, I have a problem with the way Stace puts this, because who invented the historical and literary criticism of the Bible? Bible scholars. There wasn't anybody else around to invent the historical criticism of the Bible. Bible scholars. And so it did result in a shock to many Christians, and therefore it resulted in a shock to what you might say the domain of Christian belief in general. But what it did was introduce a conflict among Christians about how to study the Bible, and that's a conflict which is still going on. But even very conservative Christian scholars in the present time know the value of historical and literary criticism, and even preachers who have never taken a college course in the Bible or in literary historical criticism use literary and historical criticism in their sermons, even though they may not know what this is. While it cannot be doubted, Stace says, that these shocks have had a powerful effect in the way of undermining religious faith, it must be pointed out that this is, on the whole, a very superficial account of the conflict between science and religion. The real antagonism, he points out, is deeper. It's not between particular discoveries of science and particular dogmas of religion at all. It's rather that certain very general assumptions which are implicit in the scientific view of the world conflict with basic assumptions of the religious view, any religious view, but particularly the religious view of Judaism and Christianity. For instance, let's look at the actual scientific discoveries, beginning with Copernicus. What did Copernicus do? The general mythological picture is that Copernicus was studying along in his university, which was ruled by the queen of the sciences, theology, and somehow or another by it couldn't be by revelation, since revelation is not part of this myth. But anyway, some way or another, he discovered that theology was just kind of bunk. So what he did instead was to produce a view of the world to be contrary to the theological or to the religious view of the world. The fact of the matter is that what Copernicus did was simply produce a simpler way of understanding the solar system. Greater simplicity is the only way in which the Copernican system is superior to the Ptolemaic. It is not any truer. It is only more convenient because it's simpler. Copernicus did not discover a single new fact about the universe. You know, people rattle on and on about how Copernicus discovered facts about the universe which Christians disagreed with. Copernicus didn't discover any new fact about the universe. Copernicus never went very far from his own home. When he walked outside and looked up in the sky, what did he see that Ptolemy didn't see? What did he see that Aristotle didn't see? He didn't see anything. He didn't even have a telescope. And so everything that Ptolemy saw and Aristotle saw, Copernicus also saw. So he didn't discover any particular fact in the universe. He made no observations on the nature or the movements of the heavenly bodies, which had not been made before. He saw exactly the same movements. He discovered no new facts. What he did was to arrange the already known facts in a new and simpler way. Now you can say that basically about Darwin and Darwin's theory of evolution, except of course that he beat the bushes and got some empirical data that people did not have before. But that empirical data did not immediately interpret itself. Darwin had to later interpret it through a concept which he had gotten from another field of study, namely from Malthus on economics and population growth. And it was from reading Malthus that he got the idea of natural selection. So you see, these are concepts that are going on in the mind of somebody. And there were a lot of people who had been doing lots of the same kind of work Darwin had been doing, for whom it just never dawned on them that what they were doing. For instance, there was artificial selection going on all the time. English people, English Puritans and Anglican clergymen were always breeding pigeons and dogs and all kinds of things and creating different breeds by artificial selection. And they were already studying insects and all kinds of things in that regard. And so if just by analogy, artificial selection might have been picked up on by some people before Darwin. In fact, it was picked up on by people before Darwin because they were evolutionists before Darwin. One of the most famous one was a guy named Dawson, who was an Anglican clergyman who produced a book which Darwin hated because its theory of evolution was not very well produced. And he figured that this guy would mess up the whole field for evolutionists. But there were several evolutionists before Darwin, but they had not gathered and produced the kind of empirical data from which Darwin was to draw his thesis. But the same thing basically was true with Copernicus, even more starkly. He discovered no new facts. He just put them together in a different way. Kepler's work is revolutionary in that he broke finally with the superstitious awe in which the circle as the perfect figure had been held. In other words, Copernicus didn't even get rid of the perfect circle, neither did Galileo. To show what is meant by saying that Copernicus and Galileo simplified the Ptolemaic view, if Ptolemy looked up in the heavens and he saw all of the same motions of the world, or motions of the stars and motions of the planets. The word planet means that which moves. So he saw all of the motions of the planets. And he explained them. Quote, he explained them. He explained them in such a way that he could actually predict their movements. So it was a pretty good explanation. And he explained them on the basis of his idea of the Ptolemaic, the Aristotelian Ptolemaic idea that the earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around the earth. But based on that assumption, he could still explain, quote, the movements of the planets. The problem is that in order to explain it, since he believed that they had to be perfect circles, that the movements of the planets had to be perfect circles. And he saw the planets. For instance, he looked up and he saw Jupiter, and what was Jupiter doing? As it went through the sky. Well, that doesn't look much like a perfect circle. What does that look like instead? That looks like a perfect circle with a bunch of perfect epicycles. And so he still had his explanation. By adding epicycles to his explanation, he still had perfect circles, and everything was fine. All was well with the world. He could explain it. He could explain the movements. Interestingly enough, since Copernicus still believed that everything moved in a perfect circle, he couldn't get rid of all the epicycles. He only got rid of 46 of them. Well, that left 34 to go. And Kepler was the one that finally got rid of the 34. So that shows you again how simple it was, how simple the contribution of Copernicus and Galileo were. They really didn't discover any new facts. They were able to, through their conceptuality, through their imagination, which is extremely important in science, were able to limit the number of epicycles that were used to explain the universe. But both could still explain it. It's just that Copernicus and Galileo could explain it in a much simpler way. You needed less mathematics to explain it. Stace goes on to say that you could still assume, since Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler didn't prove their theory, because it's not something that can be proven, it's just something that works, and it continues to work, and we operate on the basis of it, that if someone had a mind to, especially now we have computers, he might want to go back and try to mathematically explain everything that we now know in the light of the Ptolemaic view. And he says theoretically that's still possible. Whereas the ancients and the medieval writers tended to argue a priori from assumed first principles that the truth must be so and so, just like the world must move in a perfect circle, or the planets must move in a perfect circle. Modern science is based upon the belief that the only way to discover truth is to look at the facts. Now that seems like a very simple idea, and it is a very simple idea, but it is what moved science from medieval theology to the theology that supported modern science. Newton believed that there were certain irregularities in the observed motions of the planets which he still could not explain in terms of the law of gravity. If these irregularities were cumulative, they would in the course of time pile up to such great deviations that they would upset the whole balance of the solar system. Now this is the only gaps that Newton had in his scientific view of the world, that these irregularities might be cumulative and might cause things to start bumping into each other. And so he suggested that there must be only one explanation. That is, that from time to time God intervenes and puts the errant planets back on their proper paths. That is the most unfortunate aspect of Newton's thought, because what that means is that he can explain everything except a few irregularities, and he has to bring God in from the outside to kind of tap, so that the planets go back into their proper spheres and continue in that way. Well, that sets the stage for somebody like Leibniz to say that Newton's God is a very poor mechanic. He can't get things straight the first time, so he has to come back and tinker with it in order to keep it going. And that also sets the stage for Laplace, who much later showed that the irregularities in the movements of the planets, which Newton was unable to explain by his law of gravitation, were not cumulative, as Newton had supposed, but are self-correcting. So Laplace is not nearly as is not considered to be nearly as important or as brilliant as Newton, because all he did was correct a little bit of what Newton said. He also produced the nebular hypothesis, which supposedly took the place of God, and it's a hypothesis which nobody holds anymore. And so from the perspective of Christian theologians, even if this hypothesis were true, it still wouldn't take the place of God. But for Laplace it did. Because Newton, in a sense, again, had set him up. Newton had a God which filled the gaps. When Laplace found out that the gaps could be explained some other way, boop, there goes God. So he didn't need him for anything. If he doesn't need him to keep things going now, he didn't need him to start things off. So over a long enough period, these irregularities, according to Laplace, canceled each other out. Therefore, it is not necessary to introduce God to correct them. And therefore, there's no need even to introduce God to begin the regularities. In that way, Laplace was somewhat different from the deist who took a different tack from Newton. But this brings W.T. Stace, our author, to make some suggestions for how we understand what is taking place. He begins by asserting, no scientific argument, by which I mean no argument drawn from the phenomena of nature, can ever have the slightest tendency either to prove or to disprove the existence of God. In short, science is irrelevant to religion. Now, this is a radical statement, but it's a statement that most scientists, philosophers of science, and most theologians today agree with. There are still people who are working on a convergence of science and religion. There are still people who are working on arguments for God, arguments from design, but there's been kind of a mutual decision on the part of lots of theologians and scientists that no argument for the existence of God is valid, that such arguments were proved to be invalid by Hume and Kant. And so that is not really a scientific project to try to prove the existence of God. But how does this affect what Newton believed about his science? I know there have been, this may not be the interest of some of you, but I know that there have been some in the class who have been waiting on tiptoes for me to finally get around to saying that Newton's argument from design is worthless. And they wondered why it has taken me so long to do that. Well, there are several reasons why I haven't done that. First of all, because I'm trying to teach a course on the relationship between Bible and science, and it's not my job to jump at judgment every time I present somebody's view and say it's absurd. First of all, it's not absurd. It may not be true, but it's the argument of one of the greatest minds in human history. And so it would be kind of ill-advised for me, who have not yet been ranked as one of the greatest minds in human history, just to say that Newton's views were absurd. The purpose of what I'm doing is to make known to people, or at least let them understand, what Newton's views were. That is, that Newton's views were not what the myth generally assumes. That Newton was not the great intellectual giant who finally got rid of God. He would have considered that to be an absurd conclusion. Now, it may come, probably a few years ago I would have said that Newton's argument from design is worthless. But that was before I've read more recent attempts to revive the argument from design. I still might come to the conclusion that the argument from design is worthless as an argument for God's existence. But that's not a foregone conclusion. And so I'm actually going to leave the argument against the argument from design for a later part of the course. Right now, in other words, the part that emphasizes that an argument from nature can not have the slightest tendency to prove the existence of God, We might come to that conclusion later on. But what I'm trying to point out now is that the argument from, no argument from nature, that is, no scientific argument, no scientific methodology, can have the slightest tendency either to disprove the existence of God. And that's kind of the myth that a lot of people carry with them. When I first came to Rice to do my doctorate back in 1969, I lived in West University. The only time I could afford to live in West University was when I came here in 1969 without any money. And I rented a little apartment over there, a little room. But my next door neighbor was out washing his car one day, and I walked out and I was going to wash my car. And he said, he struck up a conversation, and he was a very pleasant person. And I thought, man, I was going to make me a friend here, next door neighbor. He said, he asked me what I was doing. I said, well, I just got here and I've enrolled in Rice. Oh, Rice, I'm a Rice graduate. You'll love it. You'll really enjoy that. What are you majoring in? I said, religious studies. And he just almost dropped his teeth, because he was at Rice during a period of time when even the suggestion that Rice might have a course in religious studies would just be anathema to most of the scientifically minded people there. So he just drew up, and his statement was, as if this had anything to do with what I just said, well, I don't believe in religion. I'm a scientist. Well, see, that's the myth, that if you are a scientist and if you are intelligent, then you don't believe in religion. And what Stace is trying to say is that you may be a scientist and you may not believe in God, but that has nothing to do with your being a scientist. No argument from nature, such as the argument from design, has the slightest tendency to prove the existence of God, and no argument from nature can disprove it. Now he turns to just a simple listing of what are the essential discoveries of the scientific revolutionaries. He's already emphasized how simple their discoveries were. Now he's just going to list them. What are these discoveries that had such a tremendous impact on the whole intellectual history of Europe? Well, here they are. Number one, the earth moves around the sun, not the sun around the earth. Copernicus. The planets move in ellipses, not circles. Kepler. Moving bodies will continue moving at a uniform speed in a straight line unless some force acts on them. Galileo. The law of gravitation. Newton. Now let's slowly go back through those and point out which one of them requires that we cease to believe in God. Which one of them has the slightest tendency to point to the non-existence of God? Which one of them does anything but simply states a very simple proposition that either a religious person or a non-religious person could accept or reject? The earth moves around the sun, not the sun around the earth. How does that affect whether God exists? The planets move in ellipses and not circles. What effect does that have on whether God exists or not? Doesn't prove he exists, but what effect does it have on believing he doesn't? Moving bodies will continue moving in a uniform speed in a straight line unless some force acts on them. Now, Galileo couldn't prove that if his life depended on it. How could you prove that? You'd have to have available to you a perfect vacuum. He can produce a lot of evidence that seems to indicate that direction, but he couldn't even prove that his law of motion was, he couldn't even prove his law of motion, much less proved on the basis of it that there was a God who existed or a God who does not exist. He simply believed that there was. Newton, the law of gravitation. And again, what does that have to do with whether God exists or not? Einstein has relatively radically altered what gravitation means to us today, but nothing that Einstein has discovered should have any tendency to either prove or disprove the existence of God. For Newton, of course, it proved the existence of God, all of the intricacies and the beauties of nature. We might want to come to the conclusion that it doesn't, but we certainly want to establish the fact that it doesn't disprove the existence of God. Now, does anybody have a reaction or comment to that? It's a very simple statement. That's the reason why I kind of like Stace. He cuts away all of the froth on the subject. How can any of these physical truths have any bearing at all on the problem of the existence of God? How can they possibly provide any argument against it? It's true that the Copernican system is inconsistent with the astronomy which the Christian Church at that time erroneously considered to be a necessary part of the Christian faith. But you need to understand historically that that was at that time. Paul didn't consider the Ptolemaic system as a necessary part of the Christian faith. Augustine didn't necessarily consider it a necessary part of the Christian faith. By the time of Thomas Aquinas, it was considered a necessary part of the Christian faith. And it certainly has not been considered a necessary part of the Christian faith from just a few years after Galileo and Copernicus did their work. So, it produced, for the reason that it was at that time considered to be a necessary part of the Christian faith, a devastating shock to the theological system of some people. It didn't produce a devastating shock to Newton's theological system, or to Galileo's theological system, or to Copernicus' theological system, but it did produce a devastating shock to some folks. The historical succession. Now you've got to kind of get a big picture in your mind. The historical succession, the birth of science, followed immediately by a century of skepticism, is no mere coincidence. It is a coincidence, but it's no mere coincidence. There is a connection. What is the connection? If the 17th century science has no logical tendency at all, no logical tendency at all to disprove the central beliefs of religion, how can it have produced the devastating effect upon them which it actually did? Now that's a good question. That's a question that you might want to write your dissertation on. Probably wouldn't want to write it now because it's probably considered kind of passé for doctoral dissertations. But why in the world would a century filled with dedicated believers in God who produced scientific theories have produced immediately a century of skepticism that would have shocked the revolutionaries themselves? The key to the solution of this problem lies in the consideration that men's minds, you have to understand this book was written in 1952 before present gender sensitivity, men's minds do not usually work in the way that logicians say they should. Logic has very little to do with what men believe. But the tremendous importance given by the science of the 17th century to the concept of mechanism simply crowded out the concept of teleology. In other words, the concept of teleology, which was the basic concept of all theologies and philosophies up until this point, that is, that nothing existed unless it had a purpose. Everything had a purpose. Not just human beings had purposes which they fostered in their mind, but even animals had purposes, and insects had purposes, and rocks had purposes. Everything had a purpose. There was a telos, or an end, to which everything in existence moved. Well, a mechanical view, which was fostered by Newton, and also, by the way, ratified by Luther and Calvin, because they didn't believe that there was a telos within nature itself. That if there was any telos, it was an eschatological thing that was going to be produced by God from the outside. In other words, the immanence of God did not produce a world spirit or a natural soul. That's Aristotle. So the soul of nature is not God. Nature is not the clothing of God. And so when Jay Gould is especially angry when somebody tries to insert teleology back into science, most Christian theologians since Luther would certainly agree with him that you should not insert teleology into nature, because inserting teleology into nature kind of leaves the impression that nature is a whole within itself and doesn't need the transcendent God. That is something that Luther and Calvin could not have abided, and that's something that as we've seen, Newton would not have abided, that nature could produce anything of itself. It had to be the Word of God that produced something, and not some natural entelechy or intelligence or something that produces things in the world. Okay, does anybody have a comment or a question about any of this summary? Okay, just to elaborate a little bit then on the summary, Stay says, in the beginning of his chapter on the consequences of modern science for religion, Newton was a very devout Christian. He took his theology even more seriously than his science. He would have been horrified if he had thought that his life work would result in a general undermining of religious faith. And his own opinion was that it should have exactly the opposite effect. He even supposed that his system of celestial mechanics provided a proof for the existence of God. Now, Newton's version is just an example of what is called the argument from design. And we'll talk about the argument from design in much more detail later. The historical succession, the birth of science, immediately followed by a century of skepticism, is no mere coincidence. Why is it no mere coincidence? What's taken place? Well, what has taken place is a psychological transition, not a logical one. And that psychological transition includes several elements. First, Newtonian science produced in men's minds an ever-growing sense or feeling of the remoteness of God. One of our students last week mentioned that science produced the idea of the remoteness of God. The question is, if it produced the idea of the remoteness of God, is that not producing the remoteness of God? The myth would generally assume that the idea of the remoteness of God results from the real remoteness of God. It certainly has produced the feeling of that. Any sort of living religion requires a God who is near us, who is all around us in the world now. Not that he was simply with us at the beginning, created us, and now we just operate on the basis of mechanical regularity. In superstitious ages, this sense of present nearness was produced by belief in miracles. God worked immediately in our lives by causing fire out of heaven to fall on our enemies, by sending food to us by ravens if we were hungry, or by sending manna down out of the sky for us to eat. These things did not, of course, happen to everyone, but they did happen to those who were conspicuous, who more conspicuously than others followed God's commands. And this was sufficient to show that God is near at hand and is always helping those who love Him and whom He loves. This, of course, is the core of the romantic religious response to mechanism, such as in Methodism and in Pietism. Calvinists were much more rationalistic in their view of theology. And so Calvinists were much more inclined to arguments for or against some kind of rational proposition. Methodists were more interested, and Pietists were more interested in experience. In other words, they didn't believe in producing an argument for the existence and the work of the Holy Spirit in the Christian's life. They already knew that there was a Holy Spirit and that He would work in the Christian's life through revelation. And now that they knew that through revelation, they can also experience it in their lives. So from the Methodist perspective, if your heart has been strangely warmed, that's God acting in your life. And a God who can warm your heart and give you the sense of His nearness and so forth, well, that basically has counteracted any concept of the remoteness of God that's been produced by the fact that we now know that the universe is bigger than we thought it was. Or we now know that the earth actually moves around the sun instead of being the center. Or that we now know that the earth and the solar system is on the edge of one of the Milky Way, of one galaxy, out here in the midst of billions and billions of galaxies. The remoteness of God is only produced in the minds of people who, unlike the Pietists, are unable to experience the nearness of God, or are not open to the experience of the nearness of God. What difference does it make how long it takes to get from Earth to a star? What difference does that make in terms of the concept of or the remoteness of God, the real remoteness of God? If God has created human beings in order to have fellowship with Him, it doesn't make any difference, quote, how far He has to come to have fellowship with Him. He has fellowship with Him. If He's created human beings in the image of God so that He can have a personal relationship with Him, who else but God could have a personal relationship in spite of the hugeness of the universe? Why, if God is who He is, would the hugeness of the universe actually be a barrier to His being close to His people? So that was the Pietist reaction. And as I said, there's still quite a few of those folks left. But a great many people, including a great many religious people, now live their lives in the light of a sense of the remoteness of God. Thus, so far as we are concerned, God is far away and long ago, at the beginning of things, not acting now, remote from the actual happenings of our daily lives. Now, you need to consider in your own experience whether that is what you experience. In other words, trying to imagine the piety and the fervor, for instance, of an old Methodist camp meeting, in which God is just considered to be ever present and always in and around the Christian believer, supporting him in all of his life, maybe even directing him in this way or directing him in the other way. Even lots of Christians who go to church every Sunday have lost, to a large extent, that sense of the immediacy of God in their lives. Now, there's a revival of that. There's a revival of that. In fact, the fastest growing Christian movement in history is the Pentecostal movement, the charismatic Pentecostal movement. There are now, it's estimated, about 300 million of these folks in the United States, which is an interesting development. Not in the United States, but in the world. Most of these folks are not in the United States. They're in the world. Most of them are in Asia and South America and Africa. But that number, 300 million, which is probably a low estimate, is in contrast to the fact that in 1912, 1917, I'll have to get the exact date, there were 17 of them in Azusa, California. 17 Pentecostals. And 17 compared to 300 million means that we're looking at the fastest growing Christian revival or Christian religious movement in history. Certainly faster growing than the early church, because it took 350 years for there to be that many Christians in the early church. And of course, these aren't the only Christians, but what I'm saying is this is a pretty large movement of people who believe that God surrounds their lives at all time. He's inside them, He's outside them. He tells them what to do. He leads them. He providentially takes care of them. And he can be called on at any moment because He's always directly present. And that's in a scientific world. Korea, for instance, last year became a majority Christian nation. Well, how in the world did Korea become a majority Christian nation? Because Pentecostals went to Korea. At first, almost all the Christians in Korea were Presbyterians. And the Presbyterians were very important missionaries in the 19th century when Christianity was first introduced into Korea. But they didn't accomplish the job of making Korea into a majority Christian nation. That was accomplished by these people who had the very real sense of the nearness and closeness of God. This reminds me of a statement that Rudolf Bultmann, a German Christian theologian and Bible scholar, made one time. He said, he was dealing with the question of relation between Bible and science. And he said, in the modern scientific age, it is simply not possible for people who believe in electric lights to believe in the existence of demons. Well, that may be what it seemed like was possible in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Because in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, liberal Enlightenment Protestantism had basically won the whole day. And they were, by the way, the ones who were best able to absorb Adolf Hitler. But the fact of the matter is that there are hundreds of millions of people with educations living in the United States and all over the world who are perfectly capable of believing in demons. Now, that doesn't mean demons exist, but what I'm saying is that this mindset that a modern person cannot believe in these kind of things, a modern person cannot believe in miracles. All 300 million of these people believe in miracles. Not only miracles that occurred 2,000 years ago, but they believe in miracles occurring every day. So what has developed just at the end of the 20th century then is a massive pietistic reaction to the kind of scientism that was predominant in the first part of this century. People, including a psychologist named Luba, L-E-U-B-A, predicted that by the end of the 20th century, Christianity would have basically been completely worn out, discarded, and all that would be left would be a scientific world. In between that, there have been several religious revivals, including New Age. You know, New Age is not Christian, but New Age is an example of the fact that there is a kind of a pietism inside human beings that cannot abide too many generations of scientific rationalism, because it does not, for some reason, fill the lives of people. Now, that may simply be an argument for the continued superstitious nature of people, but it is still a psychological phenomenon that people who are raised in totally secular environments are very open to religious conversion, either to New Age cults or ultimately to the revivals of some Christian pietistic perspectives. An imaginative picture of a God far away and long ago is death to a living religion. And as a matter of fact, again, sociologically, one thing that liberal Protestants, that is, Protestants who have been primarily influenced by the Enlightenment more than others, one of the things they're discovering is their own death. The major Protestant denominations for several decades now have been losing membership. They've not only not been keeping up with the population, but they've been losing membership relative to the population. And so there are many pietistic revivals going on in these larger denominations, trying to get people back to a sense of a living religion. And you can only get back to a sense of a living religion if you actually believe that God is somewhere around and is actually involved in your life and has something to do with your existence, with your everyday existence. Stace makes the point that there is evidence that Newton himself was worried about these kinds of things, worried that some of the things that he had proposed might be taken by people to indicate the remoteness of God. But there's a second aspect of this, second consequence of the rise of modern science for religion, and that is science has everywhere substituted natural causes of phenomena for supernatural causes in which people formerly believed. Since the 17th century, it has become a fixed maxim of science that no supernatural causes are to be admitted in the universe. Newton only allowed a couple of them in the terms of supernatural interventions. What people don't realize is that Newton believed that God was continuously intervening in the world because he was the one that created it and kept it in existence. But Newton believed that you should get rid of as many of these interventions to correct irregularities as possible. And then, of course, Descartes comes along, and for Descartes there are no irregularities, and there is no possible way of God intervening in any kind of miraculous or supernatural way. And this is actually the development of an unfortunate division in Christian thought between nature and supernature. You don't have these terms in the New Testament. When a miracle occurred in New Testament times, it was considered to be natural, at least as far as God was concerned. If God was the one who created nature, if he wanted to do something one way, he did it. In other words, if he wanted to do it the regular way, he did it. If he wanted to do it an irregular way, he did it. So this was not considered necessarily supernatural. It was simply God acting one way most of the time and acting another way at other times when he wanted to make a special point and to convince people of something. And that was really kind of the same view as that existed up through the medieval period. So from their perspective, there was no real dichotomy between nature and supernature. That dichotomy was actually exaggerated by Descartes. And that has been one of the splits in modern thought that enables people to be the inheritors of Western thought, which is largely theological in nature, and at the same time just completely separate themselves from any idea of God, because everything is explained within itself. All supernatural causes or all God-caused things are have substitutes of natural causes. So since the 17th century, it's become a fixed maxim of science that no supernatural causes are to be admitted. Okay, I hope that through this class we've got generally a picture, and that picture is of a vast change between an age of faith and the 18th century, an age of skepticism, psychologically arrived at rather than logically.